Hi guys, welcome to the 15th I Measure You Research Review. I'm flying solo today and I'm joined by Enda King, Head of Performance Rehab at Sports Surgery Clinic in Dublin. Thanks for joining me, Enda. How you doing?
Very good, Dan. Thanks for inviting me to be involved.
No, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us. So, Enda, we'll dive straight in. It'd be great if you could tell us a little bit more about who you are, what you do at SSC, and your journey to your current role.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at the Sports Surgery Clinic for over 10 years now. My current role is as head of performance. I'm a physiotherapist by trade. I've done my undergrad here in Trinity College in Dublin. I spent some time studying in Curtin University for my master's in Perth, and have finished a couple of years ago my PhD in 3D biomechanics and ACL reconstruction in University of Roehampton in London. And I've picked up various strength and conditioning qualifications along the way through the UKSCA and the NSCA over in the States. My current role is probably three-pronged. Number one is I'm involved in business development and service provision within the sports medicine department here in the Sports Surgery Clinic. My main clinical role is around residential rehab, so elite athletes and sub-elite athletes to come for biomechanical analysis and review, plus or minus intensive rehabilitation blocks off the back of that here with us in Dublin. And then I'm also involved in our academic research, principally around ACL and groin, but mostly around the use of 3D biomechanics in lower limb injuries in particular. So it's a nice varied caseload, keeps everything interesting, and makes the weeks fly by.
Absolutely. I know you're a busy guy and you've got a lot on your plate, but I actually wanted to dive in a little bit more detail to your most recent publication. Sorry. So I think it was back in February you published your 2-year follow-up study looking at the factors influencing return to play and re-rupture in Class 1 elite athletes. So could you tell us a little bit more about how that study came about and what the objectives of the research were?
Yeah, I suppose one of the benefits in working in a place like the Sports Surgery Clinic is you get large volumes of the same kind of athlete or same kind of patient. And so we're very lucky to have a number of very experienced and talented and prolific knee surgeons in the clinic, led primarily by Mr. Ray Moran, our Director of Medicine, who would have a very substantial practice. He himself would probably do 600 to 700 ACL reconstructions per year, along with his colleagues Mark Jackson and Colin Moran as well. And so we had this large cohort out clinically we were working through all the time. And one of our expansion service-wise was to enhance the physical assessment and follow-up of these athletes post-surgery. So the guys are doing huge numbers of surgery, but the outcomes physically can be a little bit inconsistent because of individuals or that athlete's application, but also they're going off to be rehabbed at various parts of the country or the world. And so we wanted to try and offer some continuity of care and some systematic analysis to benchmark these athletes through. So our Director of Sports Medicine, Andy Franklin Miller, set up a biomechanics lab here in the clinic. We've 2 of them running concurrently. And we set up a pathway to look at reviewing these athletes pre-op and at 3, 6 and 9 months afterwards, and then obviously looking at the follow-up at 2 years, and we're currently most of the way through our 5-year follow-up of this cohort as well. And so the idea being, number one is we see lots of them, we think they do well, but actually do they do well? Number 2 is, who or how many have issues and what are those issues? And then number 3 is trying to rate that back then from a biomechanical analysis point of view. Can we identify through testing or through your demographic data or your surgical data who has a better chance of doing well or poorly, and can we intervene more proactively? Because the vast majority of these athletes do quite well. There's a lot of scaremongering around ACL and outcomes and who gets back and re-rupture rates. And clinically, that didn't necessarily follow up with what we were seeing. But unless you're tracking them all, and we've 95% follow-up in this cohort, unless you're tracking them and seeing what does happen, it's very hard to make substantial comments one way or another. So it was built off, I suppose, a desire to see how are these athletes turning out. Those that are not turning out as desired, how many are they, why is it happening, and then can we be more proactive and evolve our care pathway to try and cater for them as much as possible.
Fantastic. And I mean, with such a large study, I'm sure getting all of the athletes back in through your doors for 2 years is a real challenge. Did you have much drop off, or were you pretty successful in terms of what you were able to do?
No, it's interesting. I think, you have to begin with the end in mind. And when you lay out the journey for the athletes and how, having your surgery is the first step in the ladder, the testing is the next step, return to play is the next step, but that we're with you not just to get you in and out and get your surgery and away you go. We're with you to make sure that it works out to the best outcome. The majority are actually delighted to get the follow-up and are delighted to be involved and see how things go, and are very interested to give their feedback on the process and on how they're doing. So you certainly we spent a lot of work on trying to have a defined care pathway that all of the athletes fed into, and people naturally opt out and they move country and all that kind of thing as well, but that captures the vast majority of these, rather than cherry picking some athletes here or some athletes there, or geography pertaining to it. So the biggest job was getting a defined pathway in place, making sure all the surgeons were feeding into it, and then it becomes kind of self-fulfilling in that you're coming because we've quite high caliber surgeons, but also you're coming for the package. You're coming because you're going to be looked after afterwards. You're coming with an expectation to be tested because your teammate has been tested, or your cousin has been tested, or whatever else. And so it expands beyond the I'm coming, I may rupture my ACL, will you fix me, into can you leave me back where I was pre-injury? And part of that is structural and part of that is physical. And so people, they want to give their story, they want to be followed up, and we're very lucky. I think we had 95% follow up at 2 years, and we're currently trending at over 90% for 5 years. So people are bought into the process.
That's fantastic. It really is. Again, I appreciate it was a large study. It is a large study. Lots of participants. Can you just touch on what the main findings were?
Yeah, I suppose if you're looking for outcomes in relation to ACL, they're commonly related to return to play, to second injury, and pain or ongoing issues or patient-reported outcomes. I think one of the unique things in this cohort or this registry is that the vast majority, if not all, were returning to multidirectional field sports. And so when you're comparing cohorts, one of the best ways of avoiding ACL injury is don't change direction or don't land. So, if you're looking for second injury groups, you need to be focusing and targeting on, analysing those that are going back to the highest risk sports. Otherwise, you're comparing apples and pears. So with a high return to play rate at 2 years, about 81%, the vast majority of those who hadn't returned were for psychosocial reasons. Either they didn't feel ready, or work and life and everything else got in the way. Very, very few, if any, were not returning because of knee function. We found that the re-injury rate for our patellar tendons was 1.3%, which would be relatively low compared to the comparative literature, and 8.7% for our hamstring tendons. So again, there seems to be a bias towards a higher second or re-rupture rate within our hamstring tendons. And the contralateral or the injury rate in the contralateral knee was about 6.6%. So the interesting bit also in return to play was that there was no relationship between time to return to play, and second injury. So whether you return from 6 to 9 months, 9 to 12, or 12 to 15 months, that didn't influence your re-injury rate. And so, there's a lot of discussion around, you shouldn't go back to 2 years, you shouldn't go back to 1 year, et cetera, et cetera. But there are lots of athletes that successfully return without second injury at the 6-month mark. So we know that there is a healing process that needs to take place. We've no measure of that healing process. So there's no way of testing how strong the graft is or how mature it is. But we know that process goes on to the 2-year mark. We know the vast majority of athletes return without issue before 2 years. So the role then of physical function and your physical capacity on return obviously would take a greater importance there. And that's where our future research has moved on to. The other part was that from our pre and intraoperative data, it was very difficult to predict who would have a second injury. So if you were to sit down in the office in front of Ray Moran, and you're a male, whatever age, whatever sport, etc., and he has your intraoperative findings, it's very difficult based only on that data to say, well, you are more likely to do well, or you're not more likely to do well. So naturally, like all these things, it's more multifactorial than that. And some of our future work now is looking to bring the demographic and operative data in with the biomechanical data and see can we create more robust algorithms around that as well. So I think the take-home messages were that, you know, ACL reconstruction is a successful way of returning to high-demand sports. The re-injury rates are low overall, lower for patellar tendon, and that what we haven't, I suppose, catered for within this is obviously there's the surgical data and its influence and outcomes, but it's also the influence of the pathway. So if you have a pathway that reviews athletes at regular time points and provides objective feedback, is that positive from a return to play point of view because they're motivated and are goal driven as they return? And is it positive from a second injury or a pain point of view because you're catching them early when they're, you know, physically below maybe some of the benchmarks that you're looking for? The $1 million question is always how good is good enough, which obviously is very individual. But if you have minimal thresholds, or if you have areas where you can, it's amazing how many athletes do a lot of rehab and physically don't look a whole pile different between the 3-month and 6-month reviews or the 6-month and 9-month reviews. And so our process is very much around not so much what you do or what the right exercise or wrong exercise are. It's physically, how do you look now? Physically, how do you look in X number of weeks or months time? And it brings a huge degree of objectivity, and it's great from a practitioner point of view because your work is under the microscope the whole time. If you're rehabbing, now we would only rehab a small proportion of these because geographically they spread across the country, but if you're rehabbing an athlete and they're retested at 6 months and 9 months and you've set 3 main goals, and those measures are not trending very strongly in the right direction, you know, naturally we all blame the athlete and the patient because they never do what they tell us. But the reality is maybe we have to look back at our coaching, our periodization, the way we're programming our exercises. So it's a phenomenal feedback loop in terms of A, objectively benchmarking you against other athletes, but also B, benchmarking my programming, because what's working for that athlete may not be working. Not that it's not working, but they're not progressing at the rate that would be expected for the effort that they're putting in.
Yeah, and to be fair, that brings me quite nicely onto my next question. Obviously, you've seen a lot of athletes over a long period, and ultimately, I guess the goal of any research is to inform practice and best practice at that. Have you used the results of this particular study, or have you learned anything over the period of time that has caused you to change your practice?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of this study, I suppose it's potentially more pertinent to the surgeons than it is. I'm not going to select the graft type, and I'm not going to say when. So, you know, certainly I would wholeheartedly encourage patellar tendon grafts over hamstring grafts based on this information. A lot of the movement, you know, towards hamstring grafts and other grafts has been due to anterior knee pain. But I mean, the primary reason you're having your ACL reconstructed is to provide structural stability to the knee and not have a second injury. So you want to pick the graft, whatever graft that may be, that does that first and foremost. Anterior knee pain is a rehab problem. Certainly a patellar tendon graft may leave you more susceptible to anterior knee pain in the same way a hamstring graft may leave you more susceptible to hamstring injury. But that's still a rehab problem. It means I need to go back and redevelop a program and achieve the outcomes off the back of that. The second thing is I would put, after the 6-month mark, a much bigger focus on your physical ability to return to play rather than time from surgery, because it doesn't seem to be supported based on this data, that, you know, time after 6 months leaves you at higher or lower risk. And it's also quite interesting that, you know, there's a larger percentage of people injuring the previously healthy knee than there is the operated knee. And we have a number of studies that are in final review at the minute around the biomechanical factors related to re-rupture or related to injury of the contralateral knee. And a lot of it is around, you know, the frontal plane and valgus would have got a lot of the previous press or coverage in the literature. But we're finding that a lot of it is to do with your plyometric ability and your performance during drop jumps and your stiffness, and the ability to control that sagittal plane. And so trying to set a high enough bar in relation to that is something that we're putting a lot more focus on going forward.
No, great stuff. No, really, really good. And I know you mentioned that this whole process is rolling over into a 5-year period, and you just mentioned there you've got some papers that are in the process of publication. What other research can we expect from you and your team in particular over the coming months? Is there anything exciting that's due to be published?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a couple of different strands. We have a PhD student, T, who is looking at the influence of visual distraction and neuroplasticity during ACL rehabilitation, and compared to healthy athletes to see what role visual distraction has in our coordination and our task execution, but also as a rehabilitation tool. Does it influence our motor learning and our ability to bridge that gap quicker? So there's a lot of very interesting areas around that. We're looking at a number of papers looking at the biomechanics of female second injuries, so that the re-rupture data we have already outside of the registry, the biomechanical data has all been based on male athletes, so looking at those at female and younger athletes. And then thirdly is trying to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to combine the biomechanical data with the demographic data and the intraoperative data to try and begin to profile people at various time points to say your risk is higher or lower, and these are the variables that are most relevant to you, because we naturally, because that's the way we rehabilitate, break an athlete down into your strength measures, your power and plyo measures, your motor control during various tasks, but they are all obviously interrelated as well. And so rather than just sort of saying one test is good or bad, it's when we look at the battery of tests, can we begin to shed a greater light on things as we go forward? So there's lots of very, very, very interesting stuff from that point of view. And it has a lot of potential in terms of how we rehabilitate our athletes, but also how we advise our surgeons and our referrers as to the current status of an ACL rehab and where things could go. Because people are always looking for the green light, thumbs up or thumbs down. But there's a lot of people that if you want to say they're insufficiently rehabilitated or they're poor movers and they don't have a second injury. And that might be because, they don't have enough exposure to the sport as they go back. It may be their genetics gets the way. It's very multifactorial. But rather than sort of saying, when am I ready? The question is, when am I fully rehabilitated? And what does that look like? And can we begin to say that when you go back to play, that's only a step on the journey? And can we not only say that this mark, you're at point, but when we review you, because it's interesting how many athletes, especially elite athletes, come back for reassessment every pre-season in that, I feel good, I'm moving well, I want to just recalibrate and see where my areas are to work on again. So again, there's no such thing as perfect because I don't know what it looks like, but there is, better and there is poorer. And if we can place you somewhere on that spectrum, you can be much more targeted in what you're doing, either from a performance point of view or from a rehabilitation point of view as well.
Fascinating. Do you think we'll ever get to a stage where we can, to a level, predict risk or chances of ACL injury through machine learning, through all of the things that you just mentioned now?
I think, when you look back at what we're doing from a medical and sports science point of view now, 50 years, it's they're not even comparable. And so when you go forward 50 years, they'll probably be laughing at what we're doing now, both from a technology point of view and from a practice point of view. So you can't get too proud about your current work or your current practices. I think only truly when all the factors can be brought into play, of which genetic type will undoubtedly be, which anatomy will undoubtedly be, and your biomechanics and your surgical data. Only when that all begins to fit into a model will you begin to get more accurate predictions in relation to ACL. And the other big challenge is, and I was kind of caught with this because I expected, re-rupture rates of maybe 5 or 6%. I thought I'd have lots of people to work off, but actually our re-rupture rates were quite low, which when you're looking to predict, the easy thing from prediction point of view is saying that you're not going to re-rupture because 98% of the time you're going to be correct. So it's difficult to build models of data sets where you've only a small percentage end up having the desired effect or undesired effect as it may be. So that makes things a little bit more difficult than, let's say, a hamstring injury where a third are going to have a second injury potentially. But I think things will evolve all the time. Technology will evolve in terms of how we can measure and how accessible it is. But I don't think we'll be able to say, your magic number is this or that, because it's the chaos of a sporting environment. doesn't fully appreciate or take into effect what we can objectively measure or what we think we can objectively measure. But I think we will get better at getting people physically back where they need to be, as opposed to, it's amazing because I do various workshops with physios and teams, and there's always a couple of ACLs within the group, and how many of them, despite the fact that they're practitioners, how many of them have ongoing and persistent physical deficits, just related to the initial injury and post-surgery period. So they just never restored their physical function independent of their joint stability, etc. So I think if we can objectify it more towards, not can I predict whether you're going to re-rupture or not, because that would probably always be a bit of a challenge, but can I profile you to say that you're physically back to where you should be or not, or back to normal, whatever the hell that is. I think that's the next hurdle, as opposed to you can return at 6 months, or you can return at 9 months, or things like that.
No, agreed. Well, you guys are clearly doing a good job. If you need some more data for unsuccessful surgery, you obviously need to do lesser job at the rehab, and the surgeons need to drop a couple of pegs.
Well, it's like everything else. There'll always be re-injuries, and same with the surgeons here will be very proactive on injury prevention, ACL prevention, and they're not going to do themselves out of business, because as long as you're jumping around and changing direction, there's going to be primary and secondary ACLs. But I think we can do a much better job here and everywhere in being more defined on the physical side of things. There are hundreds of papers on ACL reconstruction. They're very well defined process, yet there's almost no agreement or consensus or clarity on what you should look like physically at the end. And so I think that's probably the biggest gap in where we can go going forward is our outcomes are fairly good. Where is the room for improvement? And it's restoring physical function. I mean, ironically, pain post ACL or intermittent knee effusion when they return to play is a much bigger issue than re-rupture is, and second injury is, and it's completely unnecessary. And most of it's due to persistent physical deficits. So I think that's where there's huge opportunities going forward.
No, great stuff. Okay, well, thank you for your time, Enda. I really do appreciate it. If the listeners want to learn a little bit more about your work and what you do, or more about Sports Surgery Clinic in general, where are they best heading to?
Yeah, so the Sports Surgery Clinic website is sportssurgeryclinic.com. My social media is primarily on Twitter, a little bit on Instagram, is Enda_King. And my own personal website is enda-king.com. So any of our research papers or any content relevant to that will all be on those resources.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for your time, and thank you to those who have listened and watched in.